Columbia, I've seen your mountains high, seen your pretty rainbows and your blue crystal skies, watched your winding rivers as they flow around the bend. To me you're not a stranger, you'll always be a friend.
Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicoast. Today is January 5th, 2019, and this is episode 119. Politicoast is a BC politics podcast. Tell us what you think of the show by leaving us a review or get at us on social media. Most importantly, help us build the show by throwing us a couple bucks a month at patreon.com/politicoast. I'm Ian Bushfield. Scott's sick this week, so on today's show, I'm having a conversation with Too Close to Call's Bryan Breguet, breaking down the results of the proportional representation referendum that were announced right after we wrapped recording for 2018. But first, as always, Politicoast is in partnership with BC Today, British Columbia's daily newsletter dedicated exclusively to BC politics. Sign up for a free trial to have unique coverage of the BC legislature delivered to your inbox every morning. Listeners to Politicoast enter the offer code CITIZEN for access to a special rate. For your free 2-week trial of the newsletter, go to britishcolumbiatoday.ca. Welcome back to Politicoast, Bryan Breguet from Too Close to Call.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me again.
No problem. We read with interest you had this referendum post-mortem blog post, as well as a number of pieces covering the proportional representation during the campaign, and you even ran your own poll. Maybe let's talk about your poll first, and then we'll go to the results and why everyone was wrong. So why did you commission a poll?
So actually I had two polls, right? I had one at the very beginning of the referendum in October, and I had one after the results were known. So both times, the first one was because at first we didn't see much activity for this referendum. We didn't see any news coverage, and I wasn't sure if other pollsters would even really cover it. So, and I'm still trying to test those private Google surveys. So I wanted to see if I was getting the same results as others, and I did, right? The first one got pretty much the two options at 50-50. So which is exactly what every other poll had. And the second one, the most recent one, let's call it the exit poll, I did it because we knew we would have to wait 2 to 3 weeks to get the results. And I was a little bit impatient, and I thought it would be a good experiment to try to do an exit poll, because the issue with the polls we had during the campaign was a lot of people were telling us they were undecided. And so every time we have undecided, we have to make assumptions. Would they vote? Would they vote the same as other people? So asking people after they voted technically should get rid of this issue, right? I mean, we don't ask them, we don't even allow them to be undecided at all.
Right. So you mentioned you used Google surveys, and I think people sometimes hear online or Google surveys and they don't even know that that's a thing. You mentioned that also you found your results were very similar to Research Co., Angus Reid, and I think Main Street were all in the field on this. Do you think this shows that you can use Google surveys as legitimately, I guess, or illegitimately, as it turned out everyone else did?
I think so. I mean, and this isn't my first time, right? I had one of those Google survey polls during the Ontario election, like in the middle. Results were pretty close to the real one. Actually, they were closer than most other polls, but I'm not sure if it's just luck or something else, because, as I said, it was like over 2 weeks before the actual election date. I had the one for the referendum showing 50-50, and, it goes beyond this. When I was looking at the results by age, for instance, I was getting results incredibly similar to the results of other polling companies out there. So I do think that it works. The thing we learn, I think, is we're not going to do better. If other polls are wrong, most likely we're going to be wrong as well. So that's, I don't think my exit poll I had the yes winning or the proportional representation winning, but applied the margin of errors and everything, and you pretty much had a 50-50 like everybody else. So I think it works. When people think, oh, it's a private Google survey, they most likely imagine those like non-scientific polls you put in on a website, like you put on any newspaper website or anything. And those ones are not valid because there is no sampling and weighing or anything. But those Google survey, I mean, it's a normal polls. I mean, Google has a data set, a panel, and they just sample their users like any other company would. It's just that their panel is different. So I don't see any reason why it wouldn't work. It was disappointing to be wrong, but as you said, everybody else was wrong. So, I mean, I guess it's fine.
So, as you mentioned, everyone was wrong. The results were 61% voted to keep first past the post and about 38.7% voted for a switch. And this came with a turnout of 42% of almost 1.4 million votes. What, in your mind, because we'll never know exactly who voted which way, but we do have some data on which ridings went which way, or on all of the ridings, what do you think made the difference between what you found, what Research Co. and everyone else found, versus what actually happened?
So if we look at the data and the polling average, we and even by polling average, I'm even including the exit polls we've got. So not only mine, but we had a Research Co. exit polls. The first, they did two, but the first one had a simple question: what did you vote for, and do you want the results to stand? And we had an Angus Reid exit poll showing, I think, 51-49 for first past the post. So even exit polls were wrong. So that's important to keep that in mind. After that, why? If we compare the polling average to the results, we see that the main difference is the main area where the polls were wrong was the lower mainland. So if you look at the interior of British Columbia, polls were off, but not that much, and they were quite good on Vancouver Island. So the one area where really they were completely wrong is the lower mainland, or even Vancouver. So why is it the case? The polls were predicting that the lower mainland would vote in favor of proportional representation, and at the end of the day, they really voted quite against it, right? Only 37% voted in favor of proportional representation. Maybe my only theory at this point is that polls might not have reached the correct number of people who don't speak English. And we have seen an effect of both during in terms of turnout and results of the percentage of people who speak English as a mother tongue in a writing, and the correlation with the yes. So maybe a lot of polls, including mine, the Google survey that was only in English, didn't reach out to the Chinese or Indian minorities we have in some of the Vancouver suburb. And that could maybe explain, maybe those communities are simply, really much in favor of keeping the current system. And even though they don't represent the majority of the voters, that could make a difference at the end of the day. So that's my first theory. The other one is, and this one is not, it's more really a theory, a political one. The lower mainland has said no to this reform, to this referendum, mostly in the suburb. I mean, really, and I'm talking about Richmond, Surrey, Coquitlam, like even Burnaby. So really, as soon as you leave Vancouver, you see a really, really strong majority for the no. And those are all most of them are the ridings that switched to the NDP last year, and that put John Horgan in power, clearly. And it seems those soft NDP voters, let's call it this way, or those switch NDP voters, most likely either they didn't vote or they didn't follow the recommendations of John Horgan.
Yeah, I know when you sort the referendum results by constituency who voted either in favor of PR or first past the post, the ones who are most in favor of sticking with the system that we have, first past the post, I mean, besides from Peace River, which is those two ridings were like 85% for first past the post, and a bunch of the obviously BC Liberal ones like Abbotsford and Chilliwack and some of the other interior ones. Then you see Richmond South Centre was 74% for first past the post. There's a bunch of Surrey ridings in the 70%. North Vancouver is also in there. And so it's really highlighting just what you're mentioning, versus on the other end, the very PR ridings are Vancouver Mount Pleasant, Victoria Beacon Hill. The rest of the Vancouver ridings come up very high, and Nelson Creston, which is like the one interior riding, I think, known for being a bit NDP sorted. So I guess outside the suburbs, like you're talking about, those switchovers, this is where we see almost a very partisan breakdown come down, where the Liberal voters voted for first past the post and NDP voters voted for PR. And I think that's what some of the initial polls were suggesting?
Yes, and so the polls were very clear and there as well. I mean, that might be the surprising part is those results were so shocking because we've got so many polls from so many different companies and they were all showing the same. And I'm not only talking about the top line numbers, I'm talking about the breakdown by political affiliations. So every single poll we had was showing BC Liberal voters, they're really against proportional representation. Green voters, they should be in favor. But we had that the NDP voters were also in favor with more over like 70%. And it just doesn't match with the results. So as I said, either those NDP or even Green voters didn't vote the way they said, or they didn't turn out to vote. That's as simple as this. Because if it simply doesn't make sense, given even a recent polls, there hasn't been much change since the 2017 election, according to most polls. The Liberals and NDP are around 40%. The Green are stable at 17 or 19. So if what the polls were showing us about the political affiliation and the vote, proportional representation shouldn't have lost by so much. So one of those groups didn't vote the way we thought. Is it the BC Liberals that voted even more against proportional representation? Is it the BC NDP voters that didn't vote in favor? I'm pretty sure at the end of the day, we're never going to know for sure. But when polls are so wrong, it has to be a combination of factors. So I'm thinking a mix of undecided voters ultimately voted to keep the current system, a couple of NDP voters, especially in the suburbs or visible minorities, didn't vote to switch to proportional representation, and the polls didn't show this. And then you have the turnout. And at this game, I have a feeling that the BC Liberals and the No side, or the No campaign, did a much better job motivating their people to get out and to vote.
Yeah, I want to pause on a second for the BC Greens because I found that a bit interesting. Right now, as we know, they have 3 constituencies, 3 MLAs. In Oak Bay, Gordon Head is Andrew Weaver. In Saanich North in the Islands is Adam Olsen. And in Cowichan Valley is Sonia Furstenau. Now, only 2 of those ridings actually went for PR. The first 2, Sonia Furstenau's riding of Cowichan Valley actually went 53% for first past the post. But when you look at the election results there, she only got 37.5% in the election. So it's more of a split riding than a green riding. And I think that almost explains why she wasn't able to carry that riding for PR, even though you would have assumed that the MLA for the riding should be able to, if they're going to make it such a partisan thing where the Greens are very for it, the Liberals are very against it, and the NDP, it turns out, are lukewarm for it, but not able to bring their people, that the Greens should be able to get their 3 ridings.
Oh, absolutely. And not only we were expecting them to win their ridings, we thought they would be much higher. I mean, as soon as when we got the results and I saw that Oak Bay Gordon Head was only at 53% in favor, I mean, that's all you need to know. I mean, if this riding is only voting yes at 53%, there is no way this referendum would pass. So I think either the Green voters didn't vote yes as much as we thought, or let's remember that maybe 2 things. One, a lot of those ridings on the island, they have a demographic that is, quite old. They have more people aged 55 and more than the province in average. So those people, maybe they voted yes, they voted green last year, but they still don't want proportional representation. So you have the 2 effects, and maybe one was stronger. And the other thing that could happen is that, as you mentioned, those ridings are so-called green riding with our current system, but they're not, they're not stronghold. They're not historically green. It's a mostly recent phenomenon. So maybe it's wrong to simply see them as green ridings. And on top of this, I kind of remember that when I was looking at the past results and trying to analyze them last year during the BC election, I remember finding that on the Green voters, where a lot of them were former BC Liberals on the island. That we always imagine that people switch from Green to NDP, and that's pretty much it. But that's not true. I believe a lot of those Green voters on the island voted previously for the BC Liberals in some of those ridings. So as I said, that might be again the age effect, but it's in hindsight it might not be that surprising. Those voters didn't vote in favor of proportional representation as much as we thought they would, but when they announced the result, it was still a pretty big shock to people like me.
So age was one of those other things you highlighted in your article, and a lot of people were talking about this as all of the polls leading up to the election or the referendum suggested those essentially under 40 or under 35 were very supportive of PR versus those older voters, particularly those over 50, were very supportive of first past the post. And we've known for many, many elections that older voters tend to vote in greater numbers than the young. But you argue in your piece that the younger voters did vote more than expected, perhaps, but it just wasn't enough.
Yeah, yes, it's still a theory at this point because the reason I was saying this during the campaign and even now is if you look at the turnout by riding, you see that ridings that had more young voters, so the 18 to 34, they voted more this time proportionally than the other age group, or at least this is what it's telling us. Of course, it's not telling us actually that the young people voted more. It's telling us that ridings that had more young people voted more. So maybe it's the old voters in those ridings that got out and voted. So it's possible, right? It's what we call an ecological fallacy in statistics when you use aggregate data to make inference on individual data and you're wrong. The typical example is in the States, rich people historically have voted Republicans. That might have changed with Donald Trump, but historically, rich people vote Republicans. But rich states vote Democrats, such as California and New York. So you have this, weird negative correlation between the two. So we might have seen something like this year. And until Elections BC published the turnout by age, by ridings, we're not going to be sure exactly what happened. With that said, assuming this isn't what happened and the statistical analysis is valid, and the common sense, I mean, if you look online, you saw that the people who were motivated by this referendum to vote yes were young people. I mean, Fair Vote Canada and a group like this, they were trying to motivate young people. We remember in 2015 when Justin Trudeau promised an electoral reform that really helped him as well, getting those young voters to vote for him. So I still think that young people voted more than they usually do, or at least proportionally speaking, or relatively to the average. But it was most likely not enough to to win this referendum. But I want to be clear here, because I'm pretty sure some pollsters or some analysts will use this as the reason why polls were so wrong. But that's not a valid reason, because if we take the polls and we take the polling average by age group, even if we reweight those polls and we give more weight to the older demographic, we do get first past the post ahead, that's for sure. But we never get first past the post at 61%. That simply isn't possible given the age profile we had. The only way that would have happened is if like 90% of the people who voted were over 55. So we still have an issue that is more deeper one than simply an age turnout. And it's really the issue of the numbers we had by age group from the polls must have been incorrect.
Do you think what do you think can drive those systemic issues that that's what we've been talking about, but it's still hard, you're talking about this 20-point gap between what people found and what actually happened.
Well, and here on this topic, this year was an absolutely terrible year for polls all across Canada. We haven't noticed as much because, we usually don't notice as much when the polls are wrong and underestimating the party that was leading. So I'm referring to Quebec, I'm referring to Ontario. Ontario, if you ask people, they're going to tell you that polls were right this year and they did a really, really good job. But that's because the polls were showing Doug Ford ahead and he won. But they were showing him ahead by about 3 points, even by election day. He won by like 8 or 9. So this is a massive underestimation of how high the Conservative and Doug Ford were. Quebec is exactly the same. The CAQ won, but they won like they were supposed to be ahead by 4 points. They won by I think 10 or something like this. So it's the same this time. We have I'm gonna call it the right wing option. The first past the post was the more right wing since it was the one supported by the BC Liberals, and we have this option being really underestimated by the polls. So do we have a systematic issue now in this country in estimating right-wing parties in election and referendum? Maybe. I mean, I guess the next test will be the federal election this year. Otherwise,
or the Alberta election.
You mean this year?
Yeah, there's an Alberta election coming up.
Yeah. I haven't thought about it yet because I don't have a model. So you're right. We're gonna see if the Alberta could be our next test before the federal election. If we assume that it's not the same type of mistake that happened in Quebec, Ontario, and in this referendum, I don't have, maybe the low turnout. We usually know if we have a turnout that is lower than normal, the polls might be more wrong than usual, right? I remember I had this piece with David Coledo from Abacus a couple of years ago when we were looking at when the polls were wrong. And the main factor we had found was polls tend to be wrong when the turnout has changed a lot between elections. So BC 2013, Alberta 2012, the turnout was different. I'm going to even put the federal election of 2015 when the turnout was much higher than the one 4 years before. So this time, this referendum had a turnout of 41, 42%. This is much lower than the turnout of last year's election, now 2 years ago, 2017 in BC. So maybe, again, when we have a change in turnout, it makes polls more wrong because in this case, the people who actually vote are not as representative as they would be when we have 55 or 60% turnout as we do for a general election.
Yeah, that's an interesting theory. I mean, the 2015 Alberta election, people like to, I think, retrospectively think the polls were wrong because it defied their expectations so much. That's when polls were showing the NDP was polling in the high 30s to low 40%, and then that's what they got. And similarly, the BC election, the polls were showing a tie, and we got a tie. Now, a minority situation's still unlikely, but we hit that. So it's such a mixed bag of polls we've had over the last decade that you can find ones that you go, okay, this, the industry's back on track, they figured it out, but then you get a couple wild ones where either it underestimates a victory or pegs the wrong way, and maybe these systemic issues are there, and politics matters.
Yes, politics and campaigns matter, but you're right, and it seems every time we think we have it figured out. So, for instance, until this year, the last few years had been pretty good for the polls and for people like me. I mean, you mentioned the BC election of 2017. Polls were really spot on that election, so that worked really well. And so we thought, that's fine. The issues we had in 2012, 2013, where we got 2, 3, 4 elections in a row where the polls were incredibly wrong. Maybe it's in the past, maybe it was due to the fact that online polls were not really good back then, and we have improved on them. We have a better turnout or likely voter models. But I think the truth is sometimes we get lucky and sometimes we're unlucky, and that's just the way it is. And polling companies in Canada do not try to correct for any of this, right? They don't have likely voters models. They don't have turnout models. They just weigh everything according to the census. So sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. After that, we're almost a decade now after the Alberta election of 2012, and we still don't know why the polls were so wrong back then. So, and in general, the polling companies don't like to investigate why they were wrong. That's just the way it is. I mean, they're gonna at best push or publish a little analysis, and this time they could just say, other voters voted more, and that's it. That's the explanation. But that's simply not true. And I would like to mention, for instance, in this very referendum, after the results were published officially, Angus Reid published an exit poll where in their own numbers in this exit poll, they still had a 50-50 race. I think it was 51-49 for first past the post. So in other words, their exit poll was very, very wrong. And they somehow completely buried this information in the PDF. And everything they wrote and the title they give to their blog post on their website was, "Oh, why proportional representation lost or failed." And I thought it was very funny for me because it's a poll that is wrong. There is no question that this exit poll is wrong, but they're trying to spin it as, that's okay, we know why this is the case, or we know why proportional representation didn't work. So, I mean, that's problematic when they don't want to investigate or to really reflect on why they were so wrong. We have the other firm, Research Co., that had a 50-50 race during the campaign. They had a 50-50 race as their first exit polls at the same time as I published mine. And somehow magically, after the results are officially published and we know that first past the post was over 60%, they have a second exit poll. And this one all of a sudden has first past the post at 60%. So, I'm not going to call it a conspiracy, but I do think it's a little bit suspicious how, and I suspect they reweighted their data to get the correct results. But so when you see behavior like this of polling companies, they're not going to spend a lot of time trying to figure out why their numbers were wrong. And because they don't, then next year or next election, they're going to do the same thing they've done before. The only firm I have ever seen really looking into why they were wrong in one election is Main Street Research, and that was after the fiasco in the Calgary mayoral election. And it's because they got so much crap by everybody out there, they actually had to do an investigation and research what went wrong. And they did change some of their methodology. But that's literally the only example I have of a firm who really tried really hard and did implement change after they were wrong. Otherwise, everybody else just blame one or two things like late search, turnout, or anything, or people changing their mind, and they just move on and do the same next election. So we better hope then that polls will be right this year. Otherwise, we might have other surprises in Alberta and at the federal level.
Yeah, with Angus Reid's press releases, I've noticed this a lot before because they do a lot of polling on religion and spirituality type questions in Canada, often more affiliated with Cardis and the pro-religious, whereas my work brings me on often the opposite side. And so I'm always interested in their data, but I always see that spin coming out and like the numbers underneath don't necessarily always, it's not that they're misrepresenting their own data, it's just they're picking a frame to put it in, I find. And like you say, it's question 7 on the PDF, and I'm looking at it right now where, 51% told them on a poll they released on December 20th when the results were known that they voted for first past the post. So it's a interesting technique. That said, I mean, there is still interesting questions in there, like when they ask people why they support PR. And I was thinking we could bring it back just to close out on the PR referendum and maybe talk a bit about, maybe with a little bit of a pundit hat on, why we think people did go for PR or for first past the post over PR, and maybe where the future of PR goes from here in BC, because I know that's something you're personally interested in, if that sounds like a good place to close the conversation.
Oh, absolutely. I think that, that's a really good idea. So as you said, the Angus Reid and the Research Co exit polls had some questions about what people like about their electoral system. It wasn't very surprising what we got from those exit polls. A majority of people, usually, if we simply ask them, do you think the number of votes or the number of seats you get should be, proportional to the number of votes you get, most people will say yes to this question. So it's not so much that people are against the notion of having proportional results. It's more, I think, that when we tell them, okay, so if you want proportional representation, here's what will change. So now you're going to have, MLA that you don't directly elect, for instance, or maybe it's going to come from a list. You're going to have more, small parties. They might have the balance of power. And this time you're going to have more coalition or minority governments. So I think a lot of people like the idea of PR, But when we go into the details and the mechanic of it, then there's gonna be a very strong status quo bias kicking in, and they're like, they like I always say, it's like they realize that the current system has problems and flaws, but as soon as they find one minor detail they don't like about any proportional system we can offer to them, then they're gonna go back to voting for first past the post. So I think in the future, well, I don't think we're gonna talk about this in BC for the next at least 10 or 15 years, but we're gonna have maybe other discussions in Canada in general. What people like me who would want to switch to PR need to do is to really do a better job at explaining the benefits of proportional representation and the problems we have with the current system. I think this is one thing where the NDP and John Horgan during this campaign, they did an absolutely terrible job at selling PR. And we had the best example when we had the debate on TV, and Horgan just spent about 25 minutes, trying to reach young people and telling them that, PR is lit and it's cooler and this type of things without ever explaining the details and the more underlying reasons as to why we should have it. So I do think that, again, campaign matter. And in this case, explaining the details of the three systems and actually choosing three systems in the first place was probably a mistake, and it probably turned off some people who liked the idea of PR but thought that this process was badly done. They didn't want to have to spend 20, 30 minutes on YouTube researching three electoral systems. And, the NDP just, or the yes side, just didn't try to do this. So during the campaign, I was giving them the benefit of the doubt because I thought that maybe they had numbers, maybe they had data showing that was the only way to convince people to vote yes. I mean, you don't want to go into the nitty-gritty details and the numbers. You want to just have this hopeful message that proportional representation is lit. But at the end of the day, and in hindsight, this is the type of campaign that will motivate young people in urban environments. Those people would vote for proportional representation already. So if we had another referendum, another campaign, I'm talking 15 years from now in BC, the people we need to go and convince are the people living, the older people, the people living in the interior. And so those people will be more difficult to convince. And we need actual arguments, not simply telling them, trust us, PR is lit. We need to go and tell them, you're going to be better represented if you have multiple MLAs from your ridings. You're going to have more choices. You're going to have more parties listening to you. I don't know why it didn't come up more often during this campaign that the current system is terrible for the interior of British Columbia, because look at last election. John Horgan didn't even leave the Lower Mainland and the island. He almost never went. I think he went once or twice in the interior of British Columbia. And the reason he never went there is because he knew he couldn't win seats. And this isn't where he would win this election. So with PR, that would most likely not happen, because getting more votes somewhere would actually help. And so, we should use this type of arguments, I think, in the future to try to convince people. But at the end of the day, you still have all those issues that will be very difficult to get over, such as we're going to have minority governments, we're going to have small parties that could have the balance of power. I mean, you have people like Bill Tillman or Susan Anton that literally spend 30 days telling people on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter that if we voted yes to proportional representation, we would have a Nazi party in Victoria. And I don't think John Horgan or other people did a good job at trying to tone it down or to tell them, no, that's simply not true, or that's not really a risk we're going to have in British Columbia. So, and we know people care about this. We know people were afraid of fringe parties having balance of power. So we should reassure them that that's not going to happen, or we would not collaborate with those parties anyway.
Yeah, you touch on a lot of things in there. I mean, I think the biggest way I see this referendum as it wasn't rigged in any way. No. And I think it becomes clear when it was done by that, or you can argue post hoc that people saw through the rigging and therefore rejected it. But I think the ultimate flaw was that two-part question, in that it leaves the no side with just one thing to argue, that all of these systems are bad and have all of these problems, whereas the yes side has to argue against that in favor of PR and for each of these three systems. And that's a monumental task when two of the systems haven't been used around the world. And we tried on our podcast to explain them. We had the guy who invented dual member on, and I think I figured it out, but it still is not, it's like a convenient mathematical solution that doesn't necessarily resonate with people politically. Now, that said, it did do better slightly than rural-urban proportional, which I actually expected to do better in these results. Not that the second question ultimately really mattered, but because RUP had the STV option that people have thought about, at least in this province. And then you have mixed member, which is a tried and true test system, but not in Canada. And so you have all these different things going on. I saw even people criticizing John Horgan for making comments about dual member that were just factually wrong. Like you get suddenly 2 votes under it. And all of these factors add together to really build into what I think Research Co found, that headline of like confusion dominated, and that confusion benefits the status quo over change. Why go for something risky, unknown, when you could just go with what seems like it actually works? And that's the other thing, is the last election almost accidentally delivered a proportional result, whereas previous campaigns, like the first campaign for proportional representation for 2005 in BC, was kind of motivated by the 1996 election, when the BC NDP won the most seats with fewer votes than the BC Liberals.
And the 2001, where the BC Liberals won all but 2 seats with the majority of the vote, but still it looked really, really bad, right? I mean, this election, in terms of how disproportionate the results were. So you're right, that was 2 elections in a row that have very, a good showing of how bad first past the post can be. So it was fresh in people's mind. This year, exactly last year, was almost proportional. Just the Greens should have got more seats. So people tend to forget and don't realize, why is it that we even need to change? The current system works pretty well. And if you allow me, like you mentioned how there was confusion, and I do think, the 2 question system just didn't work. And I think what happened is David Abbey, when he did a consultation, he mentioned that when asking people, they didn't get like a strong consensus on like which system they should offer. And so I think their reasoning was, well, since people who want PR aren't sure which system, we're going to give them a choice. Mm-hmm. But the way it was done, there was literally the question was set up in such a way that people who are against PR would obviously still vote against PR now, even more than before, because there is even more uncertainty. But the question was set up in such a way that even some people who would have voted yes, most likely voted no, because they're like, I'm okay with one of those systems, but not the other one. So since I don't know which one will win, I'm just going to keep the current system. So that would have been so much easier to just offer MMP and define it and go with it. And, I'm not the biggest fan of dual member proportional, in particular because I think we cannot go and offer a system that has never been tested and that has, been created by a student in mathematics in Alberta. I think it's simply too hard to sell to people. But with that said, we could have offered MMP with what is called as the best loser option. And the best loser is the situation where when it's time to go get those proportional MLA, well, instead of going and taking them from a list, we go and get the MLAs or the candidates, that lost in their ridings, but they finished second or third. So we need a green MLA in the Lower Mainland. Let's go find the green candidate that did the best. So it's very, very similar to dual member proportional, but it's officially MMP. So it's the MMP in one of the in one of the region in Germany. So I think we could just have offered this one, which was combining MMP and dual member proportional. But then we don't have to argue that it's not used anywhere in the world. We can literally say, no, look, it's used in Germany. They have used it for decades. And we would have the benefits of both systems. So, I think in hindsight, it was a pretty bad mistake to offer those 2 options. With that being said, I was talking on Twitter to one of the people who was involved and either for Fair Vote BC or going to town hall and explaining those systems to people. And he mentioned that the reason they went with two questions is because before the referendum, they had numbers, they had a poll where they just asked people, do you want first past the post or MMP? And no matter which system they were offering, if they were just offering one system, they would lose 60-40.
Mm-hmm.
And so they thought that only chance was to ask a general question, do you want proportional representation? And then and actually, my understanding is Fair Vote Canada, or the yes side, didn't even want the second question. Literally what they wanted is they wanted the question asking, do you want PR, without mentioning which system? And the argument was which system would be chosen should be left to something else after. But the question should be, do you want PR or not PR? And that was the only way they had to win. So that might have been a valid strategy, but it didn't work. And ultimately, we got the 60-40 they had even before. So maybe, at the end of the day, we've been talking a lot today about how the polls were wrong and everything. But what happened, maybe a very simple answer is, and we need to remember this, is people in BC maybe simply don't want to change electoral system.
Yeah. I mean, the last thing I will note about this referendum is just you could almost see it going bad as soon as the partisan lines were drawn. Like previous efforts at electoral reform in BC have been almost a extra partisan or non-partisan affair,
Yes.
where you have large contingents of the BC Liberals or BC Conservatives and the right supporting it, and you have large contingents of the left supporting it, both for almost the broader arguments which don't know economic, political left and right. They're just about fairness in elections and things like that. And this time, the BC Liberals staked out their no side, and the NDP and Greens staked out their yes side, and it kind of fell down along that way, and everything kind of went down from there.
Yes, that's funny, because during the referendum, I actually thought that this referendum being partisan finally compared to 2005 or 2009 might actually be a good thing for PR, because it's like we have two parties representing like almost 60% of the voters that are telling us to vote yes. So if people follow the guidelines from their parties, the PR will pass. But then we're back to did the Green voters and NDP voters really follow through? I have a feeling that the NDP voters didn't follow through and most likely didn't trust John Horgan on this. And you mentioned maybe either we should have gone non-partisan at all, or actually we should have gone a lot more partisan. Like, for instance, I wish during the debate that John Horgan would have called out Andrew Wilkinson and straight up tell him, the only reason you're against PR is because you're not going to win in the future with your coalition of 40% of the voters. You know that the only reason you've been winning for 10 years is mostly because of vote splitting on the center and center left. And maybe that, let's make it 100% partisan. Let's call out why the BC Liberals were so against, but we never went there. We never call out Andrew Wilkinson and the BC Liberals as to why they were so against PR there. When Andrew Wilkinson during the debate said, I would be okay with PR if it was coming from a citizen assembly. I mean, I don't believe it for a second. I really just don't believe it. The BC Liberals spent the entire leadership race trying to defeat PR because they knew that if PR had passed, they would be out of power for the foreseeable future, simply because BC NDP and BC Greens just get along a lot more and they represent the majority of the people in British Columbia. So I think the NDP made the mistake to go partisan, but to not go hard enough on the partisan issue. So they got the worst of both worlds.
It's an interesting theory, one we probably won't get to relive. I guess the future for PR in Canada isn't totally dead, even though the federal government has killed it and now it seems dead in BC for a while. PEI has a referendum coming up, and I don't expect you to comment on that because I've barely even known that it's coming. This follows a previous mail-in ballot I think they did where the turnout was just abysmal, and it was kind of the combination of our two questions. So you had rank these 4 or 5 systems, and I think MMP won on the final ballot against first past the post.
It did 52-48, yes.
Yeah, a very resounding just suggestion. the other possibility is Quebec, where all of the parties except the Liberals campaigned on just bringing in, I think, mixed member proportional if they defeated the Liberals. And there's no word that I've seen yet whether François Legault will stay committed to that promise.
Yes, so as you said, yeah, the best hopes now. So Prince Edward Island, but at least it's the threshold is set at 50% next year, not 55 or 60. We're gonna see if they manage to convince people to vote yes the same way they managed to do it during the mail-in referendum. But yes, Quebec by now is by far the best hope. And right now, I'm gonna give the benefit of the doubt to François Legault. I have a feeling he truly wants proportional representation, and he's not gonna change his mind now that he's in power. And by now in Quebec, there's a strong consensus that they want proportional representation. It has switched over the last 5 or 10 years, where you just go back around like 2005, 2006, the only party that was in favor was the Liberals. That's pretty funny. They were in favor and everybody else was pretty much against or indifferent. And now we have a situation where everybody is in favor except at least officially the Liberal Party. So I think it's going to pass. I think they're not going to do a referendum. They're going to get pressure into doing one after what happened in BC, but I'm not sure they're interested in doing so. They really see it as like a non-issue at this point. They see it as like we have 3 parties representing 75% of the voters that want proportional representation. They represent over 70% of the MLAs in Quebec City. So why would we bother? We promise it, and the difference is the BC NDP here in BC, they didn't promise proportional representation. They promised a referendum, and they deliver. But in Quebec, both the Parti Québécois, CAQ, and Québec Solidaire, they ran and they promised, they said, no, we want proportional representation. So there is a case to be made that since they won the election, that you can see it, the same way they can implement their other promises, then they can implement proportional representation. I feel a little bit iffy about this. I would think that in order to do electoral reform, we need a referendum. And even though I'm in favor of proportional representation, I do wish Quebec would do it what I call the right way and would do referendum, in particular because I'm so tired of losing referendums in BC and everywhere that I want PR, but I want PR the right way. And I want to be able to say, see, we can actually win a referendum when it's done right. So we'll see. But yeah, I do think Quebec at this point, I would be quite confident they would vote yes, even if there was a referendum. I think the BC Liberals are dead in the water in Quebec. So even if they were the only party running against it, there is no way they would even be able to convince their voters or enough voters to reject proportional representation. And I actually think there is even a strong case to be made that some members of the Liberal parties might actually want proportional representation. Again, 10 years ago, they wanted PR when they kept losing because of vote splitting and these type of things. So they might have forgotten about this because they won like 3 or 4 times in a row. But now they're back in a situation where they're so low that actually they would benefit from PR.
Yeah, it's funny. The history of elections in Canada prior to 1990, there never were referendums on PR or similar things. You had provincial governments at times bring in different electoral systems. I know the United Farmers in Alberta brought in like STV in the cities and left first past the post in rural areas. And then when they got defeated, the next government changed it. In BC, for a time when the Liberals and Conservative parties wanted to keep out the CCF, the precursor to the NDP, they brought in a ranked ballot situation. So hopefully people would choose the not CCF as their second choice, and that would win. Ultimately, that bit them all in the ass as social credit swept in, and then they immediately got rid of that system. So it is a very modern invention, this referendum, but I do get the democratic legitimacy. With Quebec, hopefully, in my mind, if they do push forward it as a legislative agenda, they could always just do a referendum after an election or two to say, now that you've seen them both, what do you prefer?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, right? I mean, because we see that winning referendums on this is really difficult. But yes, I do think a precedent has been set now since 2000 with all those referendums. I think it's expected now. I understand it's not legally required to do so. but politically it's very difficult not to go through a referendum. The idea of having, we do it and we do a referendum after the fact might be tempting, and might be a right way, because, we see people are interested in PR. I mean, even now in these exit polls, when we ask people, do you want, the percentage of votes and seats to match? They're like, yes, we do. So, but they're a little bit afraid of what they don't know. So maybe exactly, let's do it, or Quebec could do it. And after 2 elections, we do one. I would like to mention, that was what was planned for BC, right? I mean, we were gonna, even if the Yes had won, we would have had another referendum after 2 elections. And that's another thing that I think the NDP or the Yes side did a really bad job at promoting. You had very few people who even knew that was the case, because I had friends or people I knew, they're like, oh, I don't know, it seems too risky. And I kept telling them, yes, but it's just for 2 elections. Or even in the worst case scenario, where we end up with a Nazi party in Victoria with 5% of the vote, then in 2 elections, we can just go back to what we knew. And I think that would have convinced quite a lot of people. But many, many people didn't even know. And I'm talking, like, I did an interview for CBC French Vancouver, and the journalist that interviewed me didn't even know about this. And she was in charge of researching this referendum. So imagine if somebody like her didn't know there was a second referendum plan. Imagine the average voter in the Vancouver suburb, for instance. They had no clue that would happen. And so that should have been one of the key elements of this campaign, and it wasn't put forward at all.
All right. Well, Bryan, I think that covers a ton of ground. Was there anything else you wanted to mention about this referendum or the failure of the polls this time?
No, I mean, I'm for the polls, I'm really hoping that, 2018 was a year off. At least, in terms of projection, it didn't impact me too much in Quebec and Ontario, but it did this time, obviously. We'll see. I mean, I will mention this for people who care about polls and how right they were. In Quebec and Ontario, what we discovered was the provincial polls were the one that were off, but the riding polls from Main Street were the one that were really, really right if we were to aggregate them. So my hope is that for the Alberta and federal election, that Main Street Research will do their pay access riding polls where they publish like a couple every day. And at least that will give us if it shows us the same results as the normal polls, that's going to give us some confirmation that, they might be right. So we didn't have this luxury for this referendum to have different type of polls, but maybe that would have been useful if we had been able to poll at the more local level from Main Street.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking your morning to talk to us. Where can people find out more if they want to follow you on the internet?
Well, really, the 2 best places are, well, first my blog, tooclosetocall.ca, and otherwise they can follow me on Twitter. So it's Too Close to Call or Too Close to Call with the 2 at first. But if you just search for my name, you're gonna find, or for my blog, you're gonna find my Twitter name as well.
Perfect, and we'll have those links in the show notes. Have a great day, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me, and talk to you soon.
That sounds good. And that's been Politicoast. Find links to everything we talked about at politicoast.ca. If you're a first-time listener, make sure to subscribe and let us know what you think. Support the show and get access to our exclusive Slack channel and ad-free content at patreon.com/politicoast. If you have ideas for the show, feel free to send them to us. Our intro music is Beautiful British Columbia by Serge Plotnikov. Thanks for listening.